The Mississippi River carried the autumn chill through Natchez in October of 1834. Margaret Beaumont stood on the veranda of Oakwood Plantation, her silhouette cast long across the manicured lawn as the setting sun painted the white columns in shades of amber. At 35, Margaret had cultivated a reputation as one of Natchez's most respected widows, dignified, charitable, and discreet. "Miss Margaret," called Essie, her lady's maid, from the doorway, "your sister's carriage just past the gates." Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Bring refreshments to the parlour. And Essie," her voice dropped to a whisper, "ensure no one disturbs us." As the carriage approached, Margaret composed herself. Her younger sister Elizabeth had finally returned from Charleston with her 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The correspondence between them had been sparse since Elizabeth's husband died 6 months prior, leaving her with substantial debts and few prospects. "Lizzie," Margaret greeted with practiced warmth as her sister ascended the steps. Elizabeth appeared thinner, her once vivacious features now drawn and pale. Behind her stood her children, Mary and Jane, 12 and 10, and little Thomas, barely 7. "Thank you for having us," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know where else to go." Inside the parlour, away from the servants' ears, Elizabeth confessed the extent of her troubles. Her husband's gambling debts had left her destitute, her Charleston home seized by creditors. "We have nothing, Maggie," she sobbed quietly. "Nothing." Margaret poured tea with steady hands. "You'll stay here naturally. Family must support family." Later that night, after her sister and the children were settled in the East Wing, Margaret descended to her private study. From a hidden compartment in her desk, she withdrew a leather-bound ledger. The pages contained meticulous notes, figures, and names, a record of transactions few in Natchez society would suspect a widow like Margaret Beaumont would maintain. In the flickering candlelight, Margaret's pen scratched across a fresh page. October 15th, 1834. New inventory. 2 females, ages 12, 10, 1 male, age 7. Condition: excellent, educated, potential value: substantial. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mr. Thorne, her business associate, who handled the more delicate aspects of her trade. "Your message said it was urgent, Mrs. Beaumont," he said, removing his hat. "I have a new opportunity," Margaret replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "My sister's children. They'll need proper placement." Discreetly. Thorne's eyebrows rose. "Your own kin, Mrs. Beaumont?" Margaret's eyes hardened. "Blood means little when survival is at stake, Mr. Thorne. I've built everything here through sacrifice. 3 children will fetch a handsome sum from the right buyers, enough to secure my future, and perhaps provide something for my sister as well." The candle flame wavered, casting monstrous shadows across the study walls as Margaret outlined her plan. Outside, a midnight fog rolled in from the river, shrouding Oakwood Plantation in a veil as opaque as the secrets it harbored. Elizabeth woke with a start, the unfamiliar ceiling of Oakwood Plantation's guest bedroom coming into focus. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel relief. Her children had beds, food, and the protection of her successful older sister. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Margaret's success had been built on a foundation of unspeakable transactions. Margaret had been just 19 when she married William Beaumont, a man 30 years her senior. After his convenient passing 3 years later, she'd inherited Oakwood and discovered William's secret ledgers detailing his involvement in an underground network that specialized in providing companions to wealthy plantation owners and businessmen. Companions who weren't purchased at the public auction block. Instead of recoiling, Margaret had expanded the business, operating with a level of discretion and sophistication her late husband never achieved. Her specialty became finding placements for children of good breeding but unfortunate circumstances, orphans, debtors' children, and occasionally those whose parents had willingly sold them for a chance at survival during hard times. At breakfast, Margaret observed her nieces and nephew with calculating eyes. Mary, the eldest, would fetch the highest price with her fair complexion, intelligent eyes, and already evident beauty. The Henderson family in New Orleans had recently inquired about a well-bred young girl to be raised alongside their daughter and eventually married to their simpleton son to maintain appearances while keeping the family fortune intact. "Children, I've arranged for the tutor to assess your education this afternoon," Margaret announced. "It's important we determine where you stand." Elizabeth looked up gratefully. "You're too generous, sister." "Nonsense," Margaret replied. "These children deserve every advantage." She did not mention that well-educated merchandise commanded premium prices. Later that day, Mr. Abernathy, the tutor who unknowingly assisted in Margaret's evaluations, reported his findings. "Miss Mary is exceptionally bright. Her French is nearly flawless, and her musical ability is remarkable. Miss Jane shows promise in drawing and literature, though her mathematics needs attention. Young Thomas is quite advanced for his age, particularly in figures." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We'll begin a rigorous improvement program immediately." That evening, Margaret penned letters to 3 of her most discerning clients. To the outside world, these were social correspondences to old friends. In reality, they contained coded descriptions of the children and discreet inquiries about interest. As she sealed the last envelope, Elizabeth appeared at the study door. "The children are asking for a bedtime story," she said softly. "I thought perhaps you might like to join us." A flicker of something, perhaps doubt, crossed Margaret's face before her mask of composure returned. "I have correspondence to finish, but I'll look in on them before they sleep." Elizabeth hesitated. "Maggie, I've been meaning to ask, have you any suggestions for my situation? Perhaps a position as a companion or governess somewhere?" Margaret studied her sister, noting the desperation in her eyes. A new calculation formed in her mind. If Elizabeth could be placed as a governess or lady's companion, it would simplify matters considerably. "Actually," Margaret replied carefully, "I may have a solution. I know several families seeking a woman of good breeding for various positions. Let me make inquiries." Elizabeth's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Maggie. I don't know what we'd do without you." As Elizabeth departed, Margaret added a 4th letter to her outgoing correspondence, this one concerning a widowed gentlewoman of good family but reduced circumstances, available for placement in a respectable household. The pieces of her plan were falling into place, each move as deliberate as a chess master's. The Mississippi night grew deeper around Oakwood Plantation, and with it the darkness in Margaret Beaumont's heart. The children flourished under Margaret's strict regimen over the following weeks. Their wardrobes were refreshed with quality garments, their manners polished, and their education intensified. To Elizabeth, it seemed her sister's generosity knew no bounds. To Margaret, it was simply investment in inventory. "Posture, Mary," Margaret corrected during afternoon tea. "A lady never slouches, even when she believes no one is watching." Mary straightened immediately, her eyes seeking approval. The girl had grown attached to her aunt, desperate for validation after months of uncertainty. "Much better," Margaret offered a rare smile. "You'll make some family very proud one day." Elizabeth beamed at her daughter across the table. "You're transforming them, Maggie. I don't know how to thank you." Margaret waved away her sister's gratitude. "Family helps family," she repeated her mantra, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. That evening, as darkness descended on Natchez, Mr. Thorne arrived with responses to Margaret's inquiries. They met in her study, where a fire kept the November chill at bay. "The Henderson family is most interested in the elder girl," Thorne reported. "They've offered $15,000, contingent upon meeting her, of course." Margaret nodded. "And the others?" "The Crawfords in Mobile express interest in the younger girl. They lost their daughter to fever last spring and seek a replacement. They offer $12,000. Thorne consulted his notes. "For the boy, I have 2 potential placements." The Millers in Charleston need an heir for their shipping business, offering 10,000, and the Whitmores in Savannah offering 8,000 but promising excellent treatment. Margaret made notes in her ledger. And my sister, Mrs. Walsh in Baton Rouge, seeks a companion with breeding. The position would keep Mrs. Elizabeth comfortable, though isolated. Mrs. Walsh's plantation is quite remote. Perfect, Margaret whispered. Arrange viewings over the next fortnight. Tell them they're potential patrons for the children's education. As Thorne departed, Margaret poured herself a glass of brandy, a habit she indulged only in private. The fire crackled, and for a moment she allowed doubt to creep in. These were her sister's children, her own blood. But then she remembered the crushing poverty of her childhood, the sacrifices she'd made to secure her position, the precariousness of a woman's situation without wealth to protect her. Better a comfortable cage than freedom in squalor, she muttered to herself, a justification she'd repeated throughout her years in this trade. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Mary, standing in her nightgown. Aunt Margaret, Mother said I might find you here. I wanted to thank you for the new books. Margaret gestured the child inside, studying her. Mary would adapt well to the Hendersons. She was naturally eager to please. Come sit by the fire, child. Tell me, what do you think of Oakwood? Mary's face brightened. It's wonderful. I wish we could stay forever. Something tightened in Margaret's chest. Nothing is forever, Mary, but I promise you'll always have a good home. The girl smiled trustingly, unaware of the double meaning in her aunt's words. Now, off to bed, Margaret said, suddenly unable to bear the child's presence. We have important guests arriving soon, and I need you all at your best. After Mary left, Margaret stared into the fire, memories of her own childhood flooding back. She recalled being 13, Mary's age, when her father had gambled away their home. Her mother, desperate and broken, had sold Margaret as a bride to William Beaumont. The terror of that night had never fully left her. Margaret drained her brandy glass. She was not a monster, she told herself. She was simply ensuring these children would never face the uncertainty and degradation she had experienced. They would be placed in wealthy homes, given advantages she'd never had. And if their positions came at the cost of their freedom, well, wasn't that the way of the world? Outside, the wind howled through the oak trees, carrying what sounded like distant cries across the plantation grounds. Margaret closed the curtains against the night and returned to her ledger, forcing herself to focus on figures rather than feelings. The first patron arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning. Mr. Henderson, a corpulent man in his 50s with a fastidious manner, was ostensibly visiting to discuss supporting a children's educational fund Margaret had invented for the occasion. My wife and I lost our daughter to consumption 2 years ago, Henderson explained during lunch, his eyes repeatedly drifting to Mary. Education became our passion thereafter. Margaret nodded sympathetically. A noble pursuit. Mary dear, perhaps you would play for us after lunch. Mr. Henderson appreciates fine music. Mary performed beautifully, her fingers dancing across the piano keys as she played a complex Beethoven sonata. Henderson watched with barely concealed eagerness. Remarkable talent, he murmured to Margaret, and such poise for one so young. When the children were dismissed, Henderson's demeanor shifted from genial patron to shrewd businessman. She'll do nicely. My son needs a wife who brings refinement to the family. The fact that she has no connections to speak of is ideal. No interfering relatives. We'll raise her to suit our purposes. Margaret maintained her composure. The investment would be substantial, of course. 15,000 as discussed, plus another 3 if you can guarantee the mother won't cause problems. Margaret thought of the isolated plantation in Baton Rouge where Elizabeth would be installed. I can provide such assurances. After Henderson departed, Elizabeth found Margaret in the garden, staring at the camellia bushes. What a generous man, Elizabeth remarked innocently. Do you think he'll contribute to the children's education? Margaret turned to her sister, studying the face so similar to her own. They had once been close, before life had hardened Margaret and broken Elizabeth. He expressed particular interest in Mary, Margaret said carefully. In fact, he proposed a rather unusual arrangement. The Hendersons lost their daughter and are seeking a girl to raise as their own. They're offering a substantial stipend. Elizabeth's face paled. You can't mean you want me to give Mary away? Not away, Margaret corrected. To a better life than you can provide. They would legally adopt her, provide every advantage, and eventually a suitable marriage. You would receive compensation to secure your own future and that of Jane and Thomas. Absolutely not, Elizabeth stepped back in horror. How could you suggest such a thing? They're my children. Margaret's voice hardened. Children who will starve without practical solutions. Don't be sentimental, Lizzie. Think of what's best for them, for all of you. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. I thought you were helping us, but this is monstrous. As Elizabeth fled toward the house, Margaret felt a rare pang of shame. But she quickly suppressed it. Her sister was naive, unable to see the harsh realities of their world. Women and children were commodities. Margaret had simply learned to be the broker rather than the merchandise. That night, for the first time in years, Margaret dreamed of her wedding night. In the dream, as in reality, she was a terrified girl of 13, sold by her desperate mother to a man who viewed her as property. She woke, gasping, sheets tangled around her. The following morning she found Elizabeth's room empty. A hasty search revealed the worst. Her sister and the 3 children had fled during the night. Margaret summoned Thorne immediately. "Find them!" she ordered, fury barely contained in her voice. They couldn't have gone far. A woman with 3 children, no money, no connections. But as hours stretched into days with no sign of Elizabeth or the children, Margaret began to realize the enormity of what she had done and what she had lost. Her own sister had chosen destitution over her help. The bitter irony was not lost on her. On the 5th day after their disappearance, a letter arrived. It contained no return address, but Margaret recognized Elizabeth's handwriting immediately. I would rather my children face honest poverty than be sold like cattle by their own blood. Do not search for us. We are dead to you, as you are to us. Margaret sank into her chair, the letter trembling in her hand. For the first time in 20 years, since her own mother had sold her to William Beaumont, Margaret Beaumont wept. The winter of 1834 descended upon Natchez with unusual ferocity. As December's frost covered Oakwood's grounds, Margaret withdrew into herself, her business endeavors temporarily suspended. The disappearance of Elizabeth and the children had affected her more profoundly than she cared to admit, even to herself. Mr. Thorne continued his search, returning periodically with fragments of information. Elizabeth and the children had boarded a riverboat heading north, then vanished. Their trail went cold in Louisville, Kentucky. She must have assistance, Margaret mused during Thorne's latest report. Elizabeth has no resources of her own. Thorne cleared his throat uncomfortably. There is one possibility, Mrs. Beaumont. Your sister may have sought refuge with abolitionists. Margaret's teacup clattered against its saucer. Impossible. Elizabeth would never associate with such radicals. Do desperate circumstances breed desperate alliances? Thorne observed carefully. And there are those who help not only slaves escaping north, but also others in need. The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret had always operated in a moral grey area, convincing herself that the children she placed, sold if she was honest with herself, went to better lives than they would have had otherwise. But to be equated with slave traders by her own sister was a blow to the elaborate justifications she had built over the years. As Christmas approached, Margaret found herself haunted not only by thoughts of Elizabeth and the children, but also by memories of all the other children who had passed through her hands. Where were they now? Did Mary Williams, the orphan she'd placed with the Suttons in Virginia 5 years ago, still play the harp? Did James Cooper, sent to a plantation in Louisiana, receive the education she'd been promised. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to wonder if she had doomed these children rather than saved them. On Christmas Eve, as tradition dictated, Natchez society gathered at the Mannering's annual ball. Margaret attended out of necessity. Absence would spark gossip. Dressed in burgundy silk that complemented her still striking figure, she moved through the festivities like a ghost, engaging in pleasantries while her mind remained elsewhere. "Mrs. Beaumont," Judge Wilson approached her during supper. "I heard your sister and her children were visiting. A shame they couldn't join us tonight." Margaret forced a smile. "Elizabeth took the children to visit relatives in Charleston for the holidays." The judge nodded, but something in his eyes suggested he knew more than he revealed. "Family is precious, isn't it? Particularly the young ones. They're so vulnerable." Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Mannering called for attention to announce the evening's musical entertainment. But the judge's words lingered, carrying a weight of accusation Margaret couldn't shake. Later that night, returning to Oakwood's emptiness, Margaret found herself opening the door to Mary's room. It remained exactly as the girl had left it, a book of poetry, open on the bedside table, a hair ribbon draped over the mirror, a half-finished sampler on the sewing table. Margaret sat heavily on the bed, running her fingers over the embroidery hoop. Mary had been stitching a simple verse, "God watches over all his children." Margaret dropped the sampler as if burned. How many children had passed through her hands over the years? 15, 20. Each transaction meticulously recorded in her ledger, each child's fate decided by the stroke of her pen. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had become. Not a savior providing opportunities, but a merchant dealing in human lives. Children torn from their families, sold into arrangements where they had no choice, no voice. In the silence of the abandoned room, the weight of her sins pressed down upon Margaret Beaumont with crushing force. She had become the very thing that had destroyed her own childhood, a predator who viewed children as commodities. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, Margaret made her way to her study. With trembling hands, she unlocked the hidden compartment and withdrew her business ledger. 20 years of transactions, 20 years of children's lives quantified in dollars and cents. She placed the book in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed page after page of her terrible legacy. It would not undo what she had done, but perhaps it could be the beginning of atonement. By dawn, Margaret had made her decision. She would use her considerable resources not to profit from vulnerable children, but to find them, all of them, and offer them a choice they had been denied before. And she would start by finding her sister and making things right, if such a thing was even possible after what she had done. As the first light of Christmas morning broke over Natchez, Margaret Beaumont began writing letters, not to clients, but to every child who had passed through her hands, offering freedom, education, and the return of their stolen choices. Whether forgiveness would come, she could not know. But the mistress of Oakwood Plantation had finally recognized the darkest secret of all. The monster in this tale had always been herself. January 1835 arrived with relentless rain that turned Oakwood's grounds into a muddy quagmire. Margaret's letters had been dispatched to every corner of the South, each containing a carefully worded offer of assistance and reparation, along with sufficient funds for travel to Natchez. Whether any would respond remained to be seen. Her sudden withdrawal from society had sparked rumors throughout Natchez. Some whispered of illness, others of financial trouble. Few suspected the truth, that Margaret Beaumont was dismantling her carefully constructed life piece by piece. Mr. Thorne arrived one stormy afternoon, his coat dripping onto the marble foyer floor. "This is madness, Mrs. Beaumont," he declared without preamble. "You've built a respectable business, provided for yourself admirably. Why throw it all away for sentiment?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "It was never respectable, Mr. Thorne. We both know that. Perhaps not by some standards, he conceded, but you gave those children better lives than they would have had otherwise. What do you think happens to penniless orphans without your intervention? The workhouse, the streets? Or perhaps a loving family might have adopted them without payment, Margaret countered. We'll never know, because I never gave them that chance. Thorne shook his head. And what of your sister? If you find her, do you truly believe she'll forgive you? Margaret turned away. Forgiveness isn't what I seek. I simply want to undo some small portion of the harm I've caused. After Thorne departed, his final commission paid with instructions to cease all operations, Margaret retreated to her study. The room felt different now without the ledger, as if a malevolent presence had been exorcised. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Essie, her lady's maid, holding a letter. "Special delivery, Miss Margaret." The boy said it was urgent. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. Judge Wilson. Inside was a brief note. "Information regarding your family situation. Come alone to my office at 8 p.m. Discretion essential." By 8 o'clock, Margaret was seated across from Judge Wilson in his wood-paneled office. The rain had stopped, but fog pressed against the windows like ghostly fingers. "I know about your business, Mrs. Beaumont," the judge stated without preamble. "I've known for years." Margaret's spine stiffened. "Am I to be arrested then?" The judge's laugh held no humor. "If I arrested everyone in Natchez with blood on their hands, the jail would overflow with our finest citizens. No, I'm not interested in your past crimes, but in your current reformation." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. "Your sister and her children were indeed helped north by abolitionists. They're currently in Cincinnati, living under the name Thornfield. This is their address." Margaret stared at the paper, then at the judge. "Why would you help me?" Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. 25 years ago, my young sister found herself in circumstances not unlike your Elizabeth's. She too sought help from family, me. I was building my career, my reputation. I turned her away." His voice caught. "She and her infant son died that winter. Some debts can never be repaid, Mrs. Beaumont, but perhaps yours can." Margaret clutched the paper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," the judge replied grimly. "What you've done is abhorrent. But what you do next may determine whether you have a soul worth saving." 2 days later, Margaret boarded a steamboat bound for Cincinnati. She had transferred ownership of Oakwood to Essie, a scandal that would rock Natchez for years to come, and converted her remaining assets to bankers' drafts. The Mistress of Oakwood was leaving Mississippi forever. The journey north gave Margaret ample time to contemplate what awaited her in Cincinnati. Would Elizabeth even agree to see her? What could she possibly say to the nieces and nephew she had planned to sell? No apology could suffice. No explanation would justify. As the steamboat made its steady progress against the Mississippi's current, Margaret encountered a young woman traveling alone with a small boy of about 4. They were shabbily dressed, and the woman's anxious glances suggested she was fleeing something or someone. "Are you well, madam?" Margaret inquired one evening as they both stood at the railing. The woman startled. "Yes, thank you. Just traveling to meet my husband." The lie was transparent. Under the old Margaret, this woman and child would have represented an opportunity, vulnerable, without resources, prime candidates for her assistance. Now they represented a chance for a different kind of intervention. By journey's end, Margaret had provided the woman with enough money to establish herself in Cincinnati and the name of a reputable boarding house. It was a small act of decency, insignificant against the backdrop of her crimes, but it was something. Cincinnati greeted Margaret with industrial smoke and unfamiliar accents. The address Judge Wilson had provided led to a modest neighborhood of narrow houses with small, tidy yards. Number 17. Elm Street had blue curtains in the windows and a wreath of dried flowers on the door. Margaret stood across the street, watching as Elizabeth emerged with Jane and Thomas, all three bundled against the February cold as they headed toward the market. They looked thin but healthy, their faces animated as they talked. There was no sign of Mary. Cold fear gripped Margaret's heart. Had something happened to the eldest child, or had Elizabeth been forced to make an unthinkable choice after all? As darkness fell and lamps were lit inside the house, Margaret finally gathered her courage and crossed the street. Each step felt like a mile, the weight of her sins growing heavier as she approached the door. Her knock was answered by a young woman Margaret had never seen before. Behind her, Margaret caught a glimpse of a comfortable parlour where Elizabeth sat mending by the fire, Thomas reading at her feet. "I'm looking for Mrs. Thornfield," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. The young woman turned. "Lizzie, there's someone here for you." Elizabeth looked up, her needle poised in mid-air. For a long moment, the sisters stared at each other across the threshold of the small Cincinnati home. One woman who had chosen integrity despite its cost, the other who had sacrificed her humanity for security and now stood empty-handed, seeking a redemption she didn't deserve. "Hello, Lizzie," Margaret whispered. "I've come to make amends." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elizabeth's face drained of colour, and Thomas looked up from his book, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to fear. "It's Aunt Margaret," he whispered, shrinking against his mother's skirts. The young woman who had answered the door looked confusedly between them. "Lizzie, is everything all right?" Elizabeth rose slowly, placing a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Hannah, please take Thomas upstairs to finish his reading." Her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that Margaret had never heard before. After they had gone, Elizabeth gestured Margaret inside but remained standing, maintaining distance between them. "Why are you here?" "Do," she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. Margaret removed her gloves slowly, buying time as she searched for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "I've come to apologize, though I know it's insufficient, and to offer whatever help I can with no conditions." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "Help? Like you helped all those other children, like you plan to help mine." "I've ended that business," Margaret said quietly. "I've sold Oakwood, liquidated my assets. Everything I have is for you and the children to use as you see fit. I ask nothing in return." Elizabeth studied her sister's face, searching for deception. "What changed? Did your conscience suddenly appear after 40 years? Margaret flinched at the accuracy of the barb. "I convinced myself I was saving those children from worse fates, that I was giving them opportunities. But when you fled, when you chose poverty and uncertainty over my help, it forced me to see what I had become." She paused, gathering courage. "Where is Mary?" A flicker of pain crossed Elizabeth's face. "She's safe, beyond your reach." "I don't want to reach her," Margaret whispered. "I only want to know she's well." Elizabeth hesitated, then gestured to a chair. She remained standing. "Mary is apprenticed to a milliner. She shows great talent and will have a trade of her own someday. Jane assists a schoolteacher and receives education in exchange. Thomas attends a charity school for boys." Relief washed over Margaret. "They have choices then, real futures." "Yes," Elizabeth's voice hardened. "Futures they choose for themselves, not futures purchased by strangers with ulterior motives." The indictment hung in the air between them. Margaret did not attempt to defend herself. "How many, Maggie?" Elizabeth finally asked, her voice barely audible. "How many children passed through your hands?" Margaret met her sister's gaze unflinchingly. 23. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the magnitude of the number. "And what becomes of them now? Now that you've had your convenient moral awakening?" "I'm trying to find them all," Margaret replied. "I've sent letters, money, offers of assistance. Judge Wilson in Natchez is helping to trace those sold under different names." "Sold?" Elizabeth repeated, the word like a slap in the still air of the modest parlour. "At least you finally call it what it was." Margaret nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I have no right to ask your forgiveness, Lizzie, but I am asking for a chance to help those children, and yours, without controlling their fates, to provide resources without strings attached." Elizabeth sank slowly into a chair. You speak as if a lifetime of evil can be washed away with money. Not washed away, Margaret corrected gently. Nothing can erase what I've done. But perhaps I can ensure the damage stops with me. The clock on the mantel ticked away minutes as Elizabeth considered her sister's words. Finally, she spoke. Hannah, the young woman who opened the door, is Mary. She used our middle name when we came to Cincinnati. The children and I all use different names now, fearing you would send men after us. The revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her own niece, and she hadn't recognized her. She's grown so much, she whispered. Children do that, Elizabeth said pointedly. When they're allowed to grow up instead of being sold as surrogate daughters or future brides. The front door opened, admitting Jane, now apparently called Emma, who stopped short at the sight of her aunt. Unlike her sister, Jane recognized Margaret immediately. Her face hardened in an expression too old for her 11 years. "What is she doing here?" Jane demanded, addressing her mother while keeping her eyes fixed on Margaret. Elizabeth rose. "Your aunt has come to offer assistance without conditions." Jane's expression remained skeptical. "We don't need her help. We're managing." "Yes, we are," Elizabeth agreed. "But hear her out, Emma, then we'll decide as a family." As the evening progressed, Margaret outlined her proposal. A trust for each child's education and future establishment, controlled not by Margaret, but by a committee including Elizabeth and a lawyer of her choosing. A modest house in a better neighborhood. Funds to establish Elizabeth in a small business if she wished. "And what do you get from this arrangement?" Jane demanded, still suspicious. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. I've come to understand that my sister made the right choice in fleeing Oakwood. I'm not offering charity, Jane. I'm attempting restitution." Later, after Jane had gone upstairs, Elizabeth walked Margaret to the door. The night had grown cold, and a light snow was beginning to fall. "We'll consider your offer," Elizabeth said, her tone measured. "But understand this. If we accept, it doesn't mean forgiveness. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt." Margaret nodded. "I understand." She hesitated, then added, "Regardless of your decision, I'll continue searching for the others. It's the only purpose I have left." As Margaret walked away into the snowy Cincinnati night, she felt Elizabeth's gaze on her back. There would be no easy redemption, no dramatic reconciliation. Perhaps there would be no forgiveness at all. But for the first time since Elizabeth and the children had fled Oakwood, Margaret felt something like hope, not for herself, but for those she had wronged. In her room at a nearby boarding house, Margaret began a new ledger. This one listed not prices and placements, but names, dates, and last known locations of 23 children. Beside each entry was a blank space waiting to be filled with information on their current whereabouts and needs. The Mistress of Natchez, who had once sold children, had become a woman with a single mission: to find those children and offer them back the choices she had stolen. Spring came to Cincinnati with tentative warmth, coaxing blossoms from dormant branches and drawing children into streets and parks. Margaret had taken rooms near Elizabeth's home, establishing herself with quiet determination as she divided her time between corresponding with Judge Wilson about the missing children and cautiously rebuilding some semblance of relationship with her sister's family. Progress came in small moments. Thomas, after initial wariness, had begun to seek her out, curious about life in Mississippi and eager for stories about his mother's childhood. Jane maintained a cool distance, her skepticism a constant reminder of Margaret's past sins. Mary, now Hannah, was the most complex case. She treated Margaret with polite detachment, neither hostile nor friendly, her true thoughts concealed behind a composed facade that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of herself. Elizabeth had accepted Margaret's financial assistance, though with clear boundaries. A new home had been purchased in a safer neighborhood, and Elizabeth had opened a small seamstress shop that was beginning to attract a respectable clientele. But emotional reconciliation remained elusive. One April afternoon, as Margaret sat in the park watching families stroll along budding paths, a well-dressed man approached her bench. "Mrs. Beaumont." His accent marked him as a Southerner. "I'm Daniel Cooper. Judge Wilson suggested I find you." Margaret straightened. "You're one of them," she realized aloud. "One of the children." Cooper nodded, sitting beside her. "I was 14 when you arranged my placement with the Richardsons in Georgia. That was 1829, I believe." Margaret searched his face, finding no trace of the frightened orphan boy she remembered. "Daniel, you wanted to be a lawyer, and so I became one," he confirmed, "though not by the path you laid out. I ran away after a year, found work on ships, eventually saved enough for education." His tone was neutral, factual. "I'm trying to find all of you," Margaret said, "to make what amends I can." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "Judge Wilson mentioned as much. That's why I'm here. I maintain correspondence with 3 others who passed through your business: Thomas Wright, Catherine Bell, and Sarah James." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "Are they well?" "Define well," Daniel replied coldly. "Thomas works as a clerk in Charleston. He's alive, employed, unmarried. Catherine married the son of the family you sold her to. She had little choice in the matter. Sarah escaped to Philadelphia and works as a teacher." Each brief biography struck Margaret like a stone. Lives altered forever by her actions, paths determined by her pen strokes in that damnable ledger. "Will they speak with me?" she asked quietly. Daniel considered her for a long moment. "Sarah refuses. Catherine might, though her husband keeps her isolated. Thomas is willing." By June, Margaret had located 7 of the 23 children, now adults ranging in age from 16 to 28. 3 agreed to meet her. 2 responded with letters so filled with rage that Margaret could feel their hatred emanating from the pages. 2, including Sarah, refused all contact. All. On a humid evening, Elizabeth invited Margaret to dinner, a rare occurrence that indicated some thawing in their relationship. As they sat in the small garden behind the new house, watching Thomas and Jane chase fireflies, Elizabeth finally asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her. "What will you do when you've found them all? If you find them all?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I don't know. I haven't thought beyond the search." "Because the search is your penance," Elizabeth observed. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's simply the only useful thing I can do now." Elizabeth was silent for a moment, then said, "Hannah, Mary is with child." The news startled Margaret. "I didn't realize she was married." "She isn't," Elizabeth replied grimly. "The father is the son of her employer. When she refused his proposal, knowing it was offered only because of the pregnancy, he dismissed her from the millinery." Margaret absorbed this information. "What does she need?" "Not your money," Elizabeth said sharply. "She's proud, like someone else I know. But she needs something to look forward to, a future beyond being an unwed mother in a society that condemns such women." Later that night, after declining Elizabeth's offer to stay for tea, Margaret walked slowly back to her boarding house. The encounter with Daniel Cooper and the news about Mary swirled together in her mind, crystallizing into a new purpose. The next morning, Margaret visited a property on the outskirts of Cincinnati, a spacious old house with extensive grounds, recently listed for sale due to the owner's financial reversals. By afternoon, she had made an offer. By the end of the week, it was accepted. When the deed was finalized, Margaret invited Elizabeth and her children to view the property. The house needed work, but its bones were sound. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and the gardens, though overgrown, showed promise. "What will you do with this place?" Elizabeth asked as they toured the rooms. "Not me," Margaret corrected. "Us, if you're willing." Over tea served in what would become the main parlor, Margaret outlined her vision. The house would become a home for young women in circumstances like Mary's, pregnant, unmarried, without resources. They would receive shelter, medical care, education, and training for employment. Their children would be cared for while they worked or studied. The society can be established in your name, Elizabeth, Margaret explained. I'll provide the funding but remain in the background. The women need never know of my involvement. Elizabeth studied her sister's face. And this is not another of your schemes? These women and children won't be placed once they're healthy and presentable? The question stung, but Margaret acknowledged its fairness. They will make their own choices, always. I swear it on whatever shred of soul I have left. Mary, who had been silent throughout the tour, finally spoke. And who will run this place day to day? Mother has the shop, and you're hardly qualified to guide young women toward respectable lives. Margaret accepted the barb without flinching. I had hoped you might consider the position, Hannah, when you're recovered from your confinement. You have a strength these women will need. Mary looked surprised and thoughtful. I'll consider it. As summer faded into autumn, the house was renovated, staff hired, and policies established. The Thornfield Home for Young Women opened its doors in October 1835, receiving 5 residents in its first month. Mary, after delivering a healthy daughter, took up the position of matron, discovering in herself a talent for administration and counseling that surprised everyone except perhaps her aunt. Margaret continued her search for the missing children, now with the assistance of Daniel Cooper and Thomas Wright, who had relocated to Cincinnati to help establish a legal framework for the home. Slowly, painstakingly, they located more of the scattered souls whose lives Margaret had altered. Some refused contact or restitution. Others accepted financial assistance but wanted nothing more. A few, like Daniel and Thomas, became cautious allies in Margaret's quest for atonement. None offered the forgiveness Margaret knew she didn't deserve. On the anniversary of her departure from Natchez, Margaret sat in the small office she maintained at the Thornfield home, reviewing correspondence and accounts. A knock at the door revealed Elizabeth holding a letter. "This came for you," she said, handing Margaret an envelope bearing a Natchez postmark. "Judge Wilson, I presume." Margaret nodded, opening the letter. As she read, her face paled. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, concern momentarily overriding the careful distance she still maintained. "Thorn," Margaret whispered, "my former associate. He's revived the business. 2 children have already been placed." Elizabeth sank into a chair. "So it continues, even without you." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "Not for long. Judge Wilson has evidence that will stop Thorn, but he needs testimony." She looked up at her sister. "I have to return to Natchez." For the first time since their reunion in Cincinnati, Elizabeth reached across the distance between them and took Margaret's hand. "We'll go together," she said quietly. "All of us. It's time the Mistress of Natchez faces her past completely." As Margaret met her sister's gaze, she understood that this was not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was something equally precious. It was purpose shared, a common cause that might, in time, build a bridge across the chasm of betrayal. The Mistress of Natchez, who had sold her sister's children, would return to Mississippi not in triumph, but in humility, not to profit from vulnerable lives, but to protect them. It was a journey of atonement that had no guaranteed destination except the knowledge that the path itself was necessary. The steamboat journey cut through the Mississippi's muddy waters, carrying the Thornfield women back to the state they had fled nearly a year before. Margaret stood at the railing, watching the shoreline transform from the industrial north to the agricultural south. Behind her, Elizabeth supervised Thomas and Jane as they played checkers, while Hannah, Margaret reminded herself, nursed her infant daughter in a sheltered corner of the deck. "Strange to be going back," Daniel Cooper remarked, joining Margaret at the railing. The young lawyer had insisted on accompanying them, along with Thomas Wright, to provide legal support. "Stranger still to be going back for this purpose," Margaret replied. The irony wasn't lost on her, returning to Natchez not as the respectable widow Beaumont, but as a woman prepared to publicly expose her own crimes to prevent others. The journey docked in Natchez on a misty November morning. Judge Wilson met them at the wharf, his face grave. "Thorne has gotten wind of your return," he informed them as they rode toward town in 2 hired carriages. "He's attempting to liquidate assets and flee. We must move quickly." The group settled into rooms at a small hotel on the outskirts of Natchez, away from the society Margaret had once cultivated. Their plan was simple but dangerous. Margaret would provide sworn testimony about her former business operations, supported by whatever documentation Judge Wilson had gathered. Daniel and Thomas would represent the interests of past victims, while Elizabeth and her children would testify to Margaret's attempt to sell her own nieces and nephew. "Are you prepared for what this means?" Judge Wilson asked Margaret privately. "You'll face possible prosecution yourself. At minimum, complete social ruin." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "My soul is already ruined, Judge Wilson. At least this way, my disgrace might serve some purpose." The following morning Margaret rose early and dressed with care in a somber grey gown, not the elegant silk she had once favoured, but a garment suited to the gravity of the day's proceedings. As she fastened her hair into a simple knot, a knock came at her door. It was Hannah, looking pale but determined. "I'll be testifying today," she said without preamble. Margaret paused. "Are you certain? No one would think less of you for declining." Hannah's chin lifted in a gesture that reminded Margaret painfully of the girl's father. "I'm not doing it for you, or even for the other children. I'm doing it for my daughter, so she grows up in a world with one less monster preying on the vulnerable." The words stung, but Margaret nodded. "You've become an extraordinary woman, Hannah. Far better than I ever was." A ghost of a smile touched Hannah's lips. "That wasn't difficult to achieve, Aunt Margaret." At the courthouse, they found a small crowd already gathered. Word had spread of the unusual proceedings. Judge Wilson had convened a special hearing, using his considerable influence to expedite the process before Thorne could escape. Margaret felt the weight of stares as she walked down the center aisle to the witness stand. Faces she recognized from countless dinner parties and social functions now watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to horror to vindictive pleasure at seeing the proud Mrs. Beaumont brought low. Judge Wilson began the proceedings with a formal statement outlining the investigation's scope. Margaret listened with detached calm as he detailed a system of child trafficking operating under the guise of private adoptions and educational placements. When called to testify, Margaret spoke clearly and without reservation, detailing her 20 years of operations, naming clients and victims, explaining how vulnerable children were identified, acquired, and sold. She omitted nothing, not even her attempt to sell Elizabeth's children. As she spoke, Margaret was aware of Hannah in the front row, cradling her infant daughter. The young woman's face remained impassive, but her eyes never left Margaret's face, as if searching for something. Remorse, perhaps, or some sign of the humanity that had been absent during those terrible weeks at Oakwood. Mr. Thorne was brought in under guard, midway through the testimony. He looked smaller than Margaret remembered, diminished without the power his association with her had once conferred. "Mrs. Beaumont," he called out as the guards led him past, "you'll hang beside me for this. Everything she did, I did at her instruction," he shouted to the judge. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I've already acknowledged my role, Mr. Thorne. I expect no clemency." The proceedings continued for 3 days. Elizabeth testified about Margaret's attempt to sell the children, her voice steady despite the painful memories. Hannah described being evaluated like livestock, the terror of realizing her aunt's intentions, the desperate flight north. Daniel Cooper and Thomas Wright spoke for those victims not present, their testimonies painting a damning picture of lives disrupted and childhood stolen. On the final day, Judge Wilson addressed the crowded courtroom. The evidence presented here will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for criminal prosecution, he announced. Mr. Thorne will remain in custody pending trial. As for Mrs. Beaumont, the room fell silent. Margaret sat straight-backed, prepared for whatever justice demanded. Mrs. Beaumont's testimony has been instrumental in exposing this operation, the judge continued. Her cooperation, voluntary surrender, and subsequent efforts to make restitution will be taken into consideration. She will remain free until formal charges are filed, on condition that she continues to assist in locating and aiding the victims. It was more lenience than Margaret had expected or believed she deserved. As the crowd dispersed, whispers and pointed looks following her down the courthouse steps, she felt neither relief nor despair, only a grim determination to see the process through to whatever end awaited her. That evening, the unlikely family gathered in the hotel's private dining room. The tension of the past days had left them all exhausted, but there was also a sense of purpose accomplished, of secrets finally exposed to cleansing light. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his young face serious beyond his years. Elizabeth glanced at Margaret. "Your aunt will likely face trial eventually. The rest of us will return to Cincinnati and continue our work at the home." Hannah bounced her fussing daughter gently. "Will you come back with us?" she asked Margaret directly. It was the first time she had addressed her aunt without being addressed first since their reunion. Margaret shook her head. "I need to stay in Natchez until all the children are accounted for. Judge Wilson believes there are records in Thorne's possession that could help locate the remaining victims." "And then what?" Hannah pressed. "Prison? Perhaps," Margaret acknowledged. "It would be no more than I deserve." Hannah studied her aunt for a long moment. "Deserving punishment and doing good aren't mutually exclusive. The home needs funds to continue operating. Your business skills could be put to better use there than in a prison cell." It wasn't forgiveness. Hannah was careful to make that clear in her tone and expression. But it was an acknowledgement that Margaret's knowledge and resources could serve a purpose beyond personal redemption. Later that night, unable to sleep, Margaret walked to the window of her hotel room and gazed out at Natchez, the city she had once ruled as an untouchable queen of society. Now she was its pariah, her name synonymous with an evil few had suspected beneath her respectable veneer. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Opening the door, she found Elizabeth. "I couldn't sleep either," her sister explained, entering the room. "Too many ghosts in this place." They stood side by side at the window, two middle-aged women bound by blood and divided by choices made long ago. "I was so angry when I fled Oakwood," Elizabeth said quietly. "I thought you were a monster. Perhaps you were." "I was," Margaret corrected. "There's no perhaps about it." Elizabeth turned to face her. "Yet here you are, destroying yourself to stop others from following your path. It's complicated. To hate what you did, but see you trying to undo it." "Don't confuse atonement with redemption, Lizzie," Margaret warned gently. "Some stains don't wash out." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment. "Hannah's right, you know. The home needs someone with your head for figures and organization. I can handle the women and children, but the business aspects—" She shrugged. "Are you offering me a position?" Margaret asked, incredulous. "I'm offering you purpose," Elizabeth corrected, "when this is finished. Whether that's after a trial, after prison, or after whatever justice decides is appropriate." It was the closest thing to forgiveness Elizabeth had offered. Margaret recognized it for the precious gift it was. "Thank you," she whispered. As dawn broke over Natchez, Margaret Beaumont, once its darkest secret keeper, now its most notorious citizen, began writing letters to the last unaccounted-for children, addressing each envelope with the care of a penitent performing sacred ritual. Whatever fate awaited her, prison, disgrace, or the chance to rebuild something worthwhile from the ruins of her former life, she would face it with clear eyes, and the knowledge that truth, however terrible, was preferable to comfortable lies. The Mistress of Natchez, who had sold her sister's children, had become something else entirely, a woman defined not by past sins, but by present purpose. Whether that purpose would be enough to balance the scales of justice remained to be seen. 5 years later, Cincinnati, 1840, the Thornfield Home for Young Women stood as a beacon on the outskirts of Cincinnati, its grounds transformed from the overgrown estate Margaret had purchased into orderly gardens, where young children played while their mothers studied or worked in the home's various enterprises. What had begun with 5 desperate women had expanded to accommodate 20 residents, with a waiting list that testified to the desperate need for such a sanctuary. Margaret Beaumont, now known simply as Miss Margaret to the residents, sat at her desk in the small office off the main hallway, reviewing the quarterly accounts. At 61, her hair had turned completely white, and lines of experience mapped her face, but her mind remained sharp as ever, particularly when it came to finances. The home's operations had become almost entirely self-sufficient. A laundry service, seamstress shop and bakery provided both income and practical training for the residents. Margaret's business acumen, once used to profit from human misery, now ensured that vulnerable women and children had a stable foundation from which to build new lives. A knock at the door interrupted her calculations. It was Hannah, now the home's director, with her 5-year-old daughter Lily in tow. "The mail's arrived," Hannah announced, handing Margaret several envelopes, including one from Natchez. Margaret set aside her ledger, this one recording lives rebuilt rather than souls purchased, and accepted the letters. The correspondence from Natchez would be from Judge Wilson, who maintained regular contact despite his advancing age. "Lily, why don't you go find Grandma Elizabeth in the kitchen?" Hannah suggested. "I believe she's making cinnamon rolls." As the child scampered off, Hannah took a seat across from Margaret. Their relationship had evolved over the years into something resembling mutual respect, if not the easy affection that might have existed in a family untouched by betrayal. "What news from Mississippi?" Hannah asked as Margaret read the judge's letter. Margaret looked up, her expression somber yet satisfied. "The last case has been settled. The Parker boy, he was the final child we couldn't locate. Judge Wilson found him living in Texas under a different name. He's alive, married, has children of his own." Hannah nodded. "So that's all 23 accounted for?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed quietly. "All found, all offered restitution. 16 accepted some form of assistance. 7 wanted nothing from me, which is their right." Hannah studied her aunt thoughtfully. "Does it feel like closure?" Margaret considered the question. "Not closure. There can be no true closing of such a chapter, but perhaps completion of a necessary task." The justice system had dealt with Margaret more leniently than many expected. Her complete cooperation, voluntary surrender, and extensive efforts at restitution had resulted in a suspended sentence after a brief trial in 1836, with the condition that she continue her work locating and compensating victims. The social punishment had been far more severe, complete ostracism from Natchez society, her name synonymous with the darkest scandal in the city's history. "There's something else," Margaret said, returning to the letter. "Judge Wilson is retiring, moving to Boston to live with his daughter." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "The end of an era." "Indeed." Margaret carefully folded the letter. "He was the last tie to Natchez, to what I was." Their conversation was interrupted by Elizabeth, who entered carrying a tray with coffee and freshly baked rolls. At 60, Elizabeth had found unexpected happiness in her role at the home, becoming a surrogate mother to dozens of young women while watching her own children build fulfilling lives. "You look serious," Elizabeth observed, setting down the tray. "Bad news?" "Quite the opposite," Margaret replied. "Judge Wilson found the Parker boy. All 23 children are now accounted for." Elizabeth's face softened. "Good. That's good, Maggie." The use of the childhood nickname, something Elizabeth had only recently begun to do again, never failed to affect Margaret deeply. It represented not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace that had gradually developed between the sisters. After Elizabeth left to supervise the afternoon classes, Hannah remained, watching Margaret with unusual intensity. "I've been offered a position," she announced abruptly, "director of a new home for women in Louisville. They want to replicate what we've built here." Margaret absorbed this news. "You'll accept, of course. You're more than ready." Hannah nodded. "I'll take Lily with me. Mother will stay here. She's not ready to leave what she's built. And Jane and Thomas will visit you both," Margaret added. Jane had married a local merchant 2 years prior, while Thomas was completing his legal studies under Daniel Cooper's mentorship. "That leaves you," Hannah said directly. "What will you do now, Aunt Margaret? Your legal obligation to the court is fulfilled. Your search is complete." The question hung between them. Margaret had asked it of herself many times over the past months, anticipating this moment when her self-imposed mission would reach its conclusion. "I have no plans to leave, if that's your concern," Margaret replied carefully, "unless my presence here would create difficulties for Elizabeth once you're gone." Hannah's expression remained inscrutable. "That's not what I asked." Margaret sighed, recognizing her niece's persistence, a trait Hannah had perhaps inherited from her. "What would you have me do, Hannah? Where does someone like me belong when the work of atonement is complete?" Hannah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where young mothers watched their children play. When she turned back, her expression had softened slightly. "5 years ago, when we returned from Natchez, I told you deserving punishment and doing good weren't mutually exclusive. I still believe that." She paused. "Mother and I have discussed this. We think the home in Louisville could benefit from your expertise. Not immediately, but perhaps in 6 months after I've established myself." Margaret stared at her niece, stunned. "You want me to join you in Louisville?" "Want is a strong word," Hannah replied with characteristic bluntness. "But need, perhaps, and maybe—" She hesitated. "Maybe it's time to build something new, something not defined by the past." That evening, after the home had settled into its nighttime routines, Margaret walked the grounds alone. The Thornfield home had become her world since the Natchez scandal, her prison and her sanctuary. She had accepted the limitations of her life as just punishment, never expecting or seeking release from the consequences of her actions. Hannah's unexpected offer represented something Margaret had not allowed herself to contemplate. A future beyond atonement, a purpose not solely defined by past sins. As she walked, Margaret came upon the small cemetery at the far edge of the property. 4 simple stones marked the graves of women who had found refuge at the home but succumbed to illness or childbirth complications despite the best care available. Margaret had insisted on proper burial, proper remembrance. Among them was a 5th stone, smaller than the others. It marked the resting place of Hannah's 2nd child, a son born 3 years after Lily, who had lived only 5 days. The loss had nearly broken Hannah, but she had eventually channeled her grief into expanding the home services to include better medical care for mothers and infants. Margaret knelt beside the tiny grave, brushing leaves from the stone. "Your mother is remarkable, little one," she whispered, "far stronger than I ever was." A sound behind her made Margaret turn. Elizabeth stood a few yards away, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "She told you about Louisville?" Elizabeth asked, joining Margaret beside the graves. "Yes, it was unexpected." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "It wasn't my idea, if that's what you're wondering. Hannah came to it on her own." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Elizabeth spoke again. "Do you remember that night in Cincinnati when I told you some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt?" Margaret nodded. "I remember every word of that conversation." "I was right," Elizabeth said. "Some things can never be restored to what they were." She turned to look directly at her sister. "But I've learned that sometimes something different can be built in the same place. Not a restoration of what was lost, but something new entirely." It was the closest to explicit forgiveness Elizabeth had ever come. Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time in years. "I don't deserve your kindness, Lizzie, any of it." Elizabeth shook her head. "This stopped being about what you deserve long ago, Maggie. Now it's about what good can still be done with the time we have left." In the months that followed, Margaret gradually transferred her responsibilities at the Cincinnati home to Elizabeth and the capable staff they had trained. Anna departed for Louisville in early spring, establishing the new sanctuary with characteristic efficiency. By autumn, when the leaves began to turn, and a chill reminiscent of that long-ago October in Natchez touched the air, Margaret Beaumont packed her modest belongings and boarded a riverboat bound for Louisville. She carried with her few possessions but many memories, both dark and light. The ledger of the 23 children traveled with her, not as a record of shame, though it was certainly that, but as a testament to the possibility of finding one's way back from the darkest places of the soul. The Mistress of Natchez, who had once sold her sister's children, had become simply Margaret, aunt, great-aunt, administrator, accountant, and perhaps, in some small measure, redeemed. Not through forgetting or being forgiven, but through the patient daily work of creating more good in the world than the evil she had once done. As the riverboat pulled away from Cincinnati, Margaret stood at the railing, watching Elizabeth's diminishing figure on the dock. The sisters had promised to visit regularly to maintain the delicate bond they had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. "Where to, Mum?" a young porter asked, ready to carry her bags to her cabin. Margaret turned from the railing, a small smile touching her lips. "Forward," she replied simply. "Always forward."